Thank you. As she rightly reminded us, Paris a few days ago, and I'm sure that when the organizers thought of the topic, this is the last thing on their mind was what happened, the murderous assault. But I'll go back a little further to Karl Marx, who believed that base and superstructure, that fundamentally it's economics, the modes of production, which governs our thinking, our religion, our culture, our governance arrangements. Classical economics, the concept of homo economos, the rational human being who's profit maximizing. So here you see left, the center, the right, all agreeing that it's economics and economics alone which matters. Predating Huntington by decades was this professor at Harvard called Douglas K. Fairbanks Jr., expert in China, who talks about the opium wars of the 1840s as necessary. Why? Clash of civilizations. The European liberal civilization and the static Chinese civilization. In all this, I think, on one end to the other end, I think we lose sight of the fact that there's nothing called, what should I say, predetermination, and that cultures, broadly defined, culture not being limited to Rabindra Sangeet, which is very good, of course, or to Kudiyattam, or to Lal Dei's poetry, but in the larger sense of a worldview of life. Where does this fit in? After all, man does not live, or human beings don't live by bread alone. On this point, I think I'll now start requesting our speakers. Mr. Petale, you will launch off and give us a very broad European, the post-state, post-history view of things. Over to you.
Namaskar. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the honor to share with you my ideas on the actual challenges for the second time in the most appropriate environment, of course. On the way to the Brussels airport on Saturday morning, I was listening to the tragic news from Paris. I spoke with the taxi driver, who was an Arab. We agreed that the tragedy in Paris was not caused by a religion, but by something else. Thank you for your compassion and solidarity in the moment which is not shared only by French people. It is tragic and frustrating fact that Europe is in the war. The war in Ukraine and wars in the Middle East, the unstable situation in North Africa are frustrating as well. How happy we Europeans were 25 years ago when Berlin Wall fell and Europe did reunite later. We were expecting that values and principles, the foundations of free and democratic Europe, will be shared by our neighbors and elsewhere. Slovenia joined the EU also because of its political culture and inclusiveness, not just because of geopolitical reasons. Many speakers have been trying to explain in these days the conflictual situation. They usually say that reasons are complex and complicated. I agree, but for sure we can claim that we wouldn't land in such a situation if respect for human dignity and different identities would be shared worldwide. We have not been, let's put that in simple words, enough attentive to each other. I think that cultures and religions in particular are not guilty as such. The main messages of the most spread religions are more or less the same. They teach respect to God, to man, to nature. They teach the concept of serving, not the concept of dominating power. In my view, the concept of the dominating power is crucial. Let's remind us the ancient Romans who used the word culture first. The Latin verb cultivare means to grow, to cultivate. Using modern terminology, we can say that the term culture has had organic nature from the very beginning. Organic would mean inclusive. We usually don't get into conflict when we are inclusive, but when we act in an inclusive way. When we get into a conflict, when we don't share, when things are imposed, when diversity and identities are not respected. Some also say globalization is guilty. I don't agree. But I think that leaders are responsible, first of all, especially those who follow exclusive concept of power. It would be much better if politics did not lose its purpose so frequently, as it was said by one of the previous speakers today. But it is worth to say something about globalization. It brings us benefits, opportunities, and threats. What is needed is a culture of globalization. Globalization may not treat identities, but promote them. There are two ways to deal with diversity: to live with it or to fight against it. First way means respect to the other, sharing, inclusiveness, openness, dialogue, and cooperation. That was the way of the founding fathers of the European Union. The second one means imposing exclusion, persecution, violence. In the second part of my intervention, I would like to promote the idea of cooperation between India and European Union, which could be an example of the partnership in a globalized world. You know that we are preparing or we are negotiating free trade agreement, one of the many which are in preparation, have been in preparation in recent years. In the next decades, India will certainly enjoy a huge economic transformation, and economic ambitions of India are known. But this transformation, under certain prerequisites, could also have a vast impact on the world's climate system. The big question confronting India's developments is whether India's growth will also mean soaring carbon emissions and climate health risks. India may feel its growth could be hampered by having to promise decreasing carbon dioxide emissions targets in absolute terms. As a nation, India may feel that capping emissions would mean denying Indians the chance to better their lives. Dear friends, in this reasoning, I don't really see a conflict at all. I believe that there is actually a big opportunity in pursuing successful growth rates and equally ambitious sustainable environmental and emissions targets. It is all about sharing and seizing the opportunity. It is not enough to set new targets in Paris, where leaders will for sure show different ambitions. Some of them will speak for more, some of them will fight for less. And targets alone could lead to new frustrations. We have to think about partnerships in that regard. Heading towards climate negotiations in Paris in about 2 weeks, I addressed in the European Parliament Mr. Laurent Fabius, President of COP21 and Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, stating that the EU, with its 28 member states, could become a strategic partner of India as the one who could genuinely contribute both towards Indian growth and the greening of its economy. I consider of primary importance that India commits towards an absolute decrease in future emissions, and in exchange, I believe that the EU would be well placed to commit towards sharing and investing in India's green growth and energy efficiency needs. Next, there should be consistency in concepts, values, and principles in order to render healthier, more prosperous, and sustainable societies. In this sense, I consider that there has been too little attention given in national policy efforts and in the international climate negotiations to the critical issue of how our changing climate is putting the health and well-being of people at risk. I consider that an approach to climate change needs far greater emphasis on human health, and in this requires a coordinated approach between all levels of government, the civil society, and strong leadership from the governments. Coming back to COP21, there is a need for international leadership from COP21 participants to ensure that the health impacts of climate change are recognized by national governments as a key threat to their citizens' health, requiring immediate planning and action. Ladies and gentlemen, let's summarize. Civilizations and cultures come and go. They have their own biology, but we can certainly learn from them. A culture disappears when it loses its internal power, its soul, It stands for sustainability. It may sound romantic, but I will say globalization has to be cultivated. It has to find its soul. Profit-based and oil-driven concepts are not sufficient. I count on India in that regard. Let's work together on global Mahatma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peterle. I think you gave us most of us who think of cultures in conflict obviously think on different lines. And I'm glad you brought us a very new perspective in how global agendas which are set can be seen as conflicting the needs or our aspirations of the developing countries. And whether even in this we could find a global Mahatma, as you rightly said. And I'll now turn to Ambassador Mohammad Zamir, who was at Rio 1992 negotiating Agenda 21. So I'm sure today he will not be talking about that. Over to you, Ambassador.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here today. But before I start, I would like to first seek the blessings of God, the Creator, for all those who have unfortunately passed away before their time in Paris a few hours, 2 days ago. May their souls rest in peace. There does not appear to be any exact single definition of culture because it keeps on changing and evolving. It has been described, culture has been described by sociologists as a way of life, especially the general customs and beliefs of a particular group of people at a point of time. It is also used to denote the complex networks of practices, accumulated knowledge, and ideas that are transmitted through social interaction and exist in specific human groups or cultures. Some of the aspects which end up as being part of the cultural generalized tradition is language, social practices, for example, kinship, gender, the way you cook, what you cook, shelter, clothing, marriage, art, music, dance, ritual, and religion. They're all called cultural universals. Now, cultural groups may share race, ethnicity, or nationality, but they also arise from cleavages of generation, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, ability and disability, political and religious affiliation, language, and gender. And cultures are internally affected. It was a long paper, but the chairman was very kind to point out that we have very short time, so I'm just touching on certain points. Cultures are internally affected not only by forces encouraging change, but also by forces resisting change. This is an important element which we all have to remember. Social conflict and the development of technologies, it may be noted, can also produce changes within a society by altering social dynamics, promoting new cultural models, and spurring or enabling generative action. I remember when we were young and in school, we used to come back from school, and first thing it was in our mind is how do we go out, when do we go out and play cricket or football? But nowadays I notice amongst my grandchildren, the first thing they do when they come back from school is to take out their laptop or take out their small thing, and they are busy looking at that. It's very difficult to push them out and say, go and run or go and play something. It's very difficult. The 8 countries within the South Asian region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, they have a very holistic approach towards civilization. It's been called Indic civilization. And these countries, while we talk about separate cultures, have one thing in common. They have separate footprints, but that also includes Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Christian, and Sanskrit connotations. And that is reflected in the way they interpret the people who are followers of Hinduism or Islam or Christianity or Buddhism or even Zoroastrianism. Because I found that when I was posted in Iran, I found that the Parsi community, the way they follow their rituals in Maharashtra, is sometimes looked upon as different from some of the rituals followed in Iran, because that's Zoroastrianism which was practiced there in terms of rituals. This has also impacted on the growth of rituals within their evolving cultural scenario. Symbolic significance has also contributed to the complex and multidimensional scenario and resulted in differing conventions and social norms. This in turn has also created differences of approach in resolving contentious issues linked to important questions like gender, empowerment, and accessing to rights and opportunities. Here we were listening just before this to important politicians talking about politics, and I was reminded of George Orwell, An Animal Farm, where they said that all animals are equal in the beginning, and then they changed the sign to say all animals are equal, but some are more equal. So that applies for human beings as well. And that is partly due to the cultural complexities. The more complex and differentiated the society, the more numerous are potential groupings. Culture is also connected to identity in two other important ways. First, culture makes available a reservoir of shared symbols, and as such, collective identity anchors individual identity. This in turn helps to constitute collective or group identity. Now, cultural conflict is a type of conflict that occurs when different cultural values and beliefs clash. Cultural conflicts intensify when these differences become reflected in politics, particularly at the macro level. This happens because culture is a powerful and often unconscious tool which influences our perception and our behavior. In Bangladesh, a country of 160 million people, I have Ambassador Veena Sikri, who was the Indian High Commissioner to Bangladesh, sitting in the audience, my good friend, and tennis partner at one. She was there. And there has been a tectonic shift in the perception of culture since the War of Liberation in 1971. It raised greater awareness. We lost 3 million people in that war. It has raised greater awareness about pristine Bangla values as contained in folk music, dance, forms of poetry, and use of Bangla traditional handicrafts. It has also led to divisions within certain sections of the society about the need to practice secularism, which is equal treatment of religions, and tolerance with care and commitment. I say this because as we talk of civilization, we must remember, again, what George Bernard Shaw, I was discussing it in the morning today with my friends on the dais, in Man and Superman, he wrote, and man is God's best creation, but God is also man's best creation. Fortunately, there was no IS at that time. Now, we are also forgetting when we say this. I remember an ayat from the Quran which says, وَاَيْتَسَمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. It says that the Creator wants you all to hold on fast to His rope and do not distinguish yourself and differentiate yourself in front of the Creator, but hold on to the rope which He has given you. So that shows the general feeling is be together. Cultural pluralism has become the multifaceted bridge through which difficulties are being overcome in Bangladesh. Spirituality and mysticism adds to the cultural diversity and also helps to find common denominators among regional variations. I've just come from Dhaka, and we for 4 days had an international literary cultural festival of folk festival, and we had singers of Baul and Lalon and others from all over South Asia, from Japan, from Thailand, from Malaysia, from Afghanistan, and from other parts of the world. It was fantastic. There is also the question of how to resolve the cultural differences that may lead to conflict situations in the narrower domain. I'm referring to this because in Bangladesh, as you all probably know, it's a very large country of 160 million people. But in the last 12 years, the female population within the working community has grown immensely by millions because of the ready-made garment industry. Now, previously, because the large majority of people in Bangladesh are of Muslim origin, it was not considered the right thing for ladies to go and work outside. But here for the first time was an economic opportunity and they came in. Now that led to, we carried out a survey 3 years ago to find out the socio-economic dimensions of the ready-made garment industry, because that produces about $26 billion of exports for us. And we found out some small elements of culture which was creating a degree of, let's say, unhappiness among some people. For example, in the use of caps. Should someone wear a cap at the workplace? Because that has become a symbolical reference. Time to set apart during work each day for prayer or time off for special religious days. Question about how food was prepared for the workers. Ideas about appropriate social and sexual behavior and work ethics. There were also potential stress over non-verbal behavior, including eye contact, facial expressions, and hand gestures. And these points arose because millions of women were in the workplace. Now, that was a very subtle way of the cultural conflict entering the paradigm and creating difficulties within that matrix. Cultural diplomacy may be referred to, in this context, as an important tool to resolve the way forward, to resolve any potential cultural conflict. And that should be seen as a form of public diplomacy and soft power that includes exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples in order to foster mutual understandings. Such a dynamics from the point of view can and does play an important role in achieving national security aims. I'll end here by saying that we have a lot to learn from India, and I have learned a lot from Goa because it's my first visit to Goa. I've never been to Goa before. And that brings me, in the context of this, brings me to the way forward. A very least common denominator, but an important denominator which can resolve the cultural clash of civilizations is tourism. Here, I'm underlining that the importance of tourism as a tool for appreciating cultural diversity and for bringing people together. India, particularly, is an example of this reality. This process reduces the impact of differences in cultures becoming catalysts for conflict. Instead, it promotes awareness that differences can be the source of pleasure, bonding, and enjoyment. In this context, Mr. Chairman, I'll just recall that we had a wonderful discussion yesterday where Sadhguruji gave us a better understanding of culture. I'm sorry he's not here today, but we could learn from him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it was a very good overarching perspective that you gave us. And you ended by being rooted in the soil that we are in today. Going on, I think from him, we now turn to Dhruv Jaishankar, who writes on strategic affairs. And you would think, where does strategic affairs fit into culture? But I'm sure he'll bring a perspective to it. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the India Ideas Conclave organizers for inviting me here. I was initially somewhat surprised that I had been asked to speak about cultures in conflict, particularly given the stellar group of individuals present in the audience who know a lot more about the subject than I ever could. I'm, as the chair mentioned, only a scholar and observer of international politics, but I've also been a student of history. And while culture has long been the study of the subject of historical inquiry, it has actually been unfashionable to talk about culture in international political circles. It's often deemed politically incorrect, unscientific, and generally hasn't matched prevailing academic traditions. But coming from these two vantage points, international politics and history, I thought I would share two rather simple, basic thoughts with you, some of which actually mirror the previous two speakers. For the first, let me begin with a short story. 405 years ago, almost to the day, we're off by just 9 days, a fleet sailed up the mouth of the river, not even 100 meters from where we are sitting, and swiftly conquered the port of Goa. The fleet was from Portugal, a small kingdom on the edge of Europe. That a European state, particularly a small state on Europe's margins, would have begun a process of global colonization was not necessarily preordained. The most powerful states in the late 15th century were the Ottoman Empire, the Ming Dynasty in China, and even a number of warring states in India. Nor was Europe's predominance simply the result of one decisive factor. If it had simply been superior navigation and seamanship, all of us would have been colonized long ago by the Polynesians. Why Europe dominated the world between the 15th and the mid-20th centuries has been the subject of countless books. Many have made the cases for Europe's geographical advantages or its superior technology. But there's no discounting the role of culture. One of the most vocal proponents of this view was the late historian David Landis. Landis wrote a book called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, in which he made the case for why culture has been decisive in shaping why some countries became rich while others remained poor. Now, this argument is somewhat compelling. The trouble is that it becomes very easy to make a false case for cultural determinism. People erroneously argue that a country with a certain culture is destined to be poor and weak, while others are destined to be rich and powerful. Now, this is simply untrue, and history is full of examples of rapid cultural change. 50 years ago, for example, it would have been impossible to imagine that a Chinese society behind the bamboo curtain, dominated by collectivism, would transform and enthusiastically embrace capitalism and consumerism. Or take political culture. Not long ago, in the early 1990s, Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia or Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore were trumpeting the notion of Asian values. Yet we have seen more and more Asian states embrace concepts of universal values since the late 1990s. To give but one example, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talks about universal values at almost every opportunity. Indeed, I've often made the case that liberal democracy can no longer be considered a Western value, particularly when 70% of the people living under liberal democracy are actually outside the West. We can think of other examples of rapid cultural change. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Morocco, and every Moroccan I met with loved Bollywood and identified Bollywood as synonymous with Indian culture. Yet Bollywood is just a century old, if even. Now let's take a more insidious example of rapidly changing culture, suicide bombings. During the Afghan Mujahideen campaign in the 1980s against the Soviet Union, suicide bombings were unheard of. The tactic was in fact pioneered by the LTT in Sri Lanka. Yet now suicide bombings have become commonplace, not just in Afghanistan, but farther afield, as we have seen just recently in Paris. So this is my first point, which is culture matters, and we must not shy away from acknowledging that. But it is not and has never been immutable. Let's not equate culture with tradition. Traditions can remain even as culture changes. Just as relevant, and echoing the points made on the previous panel, it's completely inexcusable to say that some of us are destined to be impoverished or uneducated. We are like that only is no longer a permissible excuse. Now, that's the historical approach. Let's get to the question of cultures in conflict, the topic of today's panel. In the study of international politics, it's hard to address the issues of cultures in conflict without echoing Samuel Huntington's famous Clash of Civilizations thesis. And this was articulated nearly 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, in fact. Huntington basically argued that civilizations would be the major fault lines in international politics. By and large, and fortunately, he has been proven mostly wrong. As the Prime Minister of Bhutan mentioned yesterday, civilizations may be in competition, but it is fundamentally a friendly competition, not a clash. It is competition in the realms of ideas that they give to the world, and the entire world has benefited from them. And we can see this whether Buddhism in India, printing in China, democracy in Greece. Civilizations are not fundamentally clashing. Our Prime Minister is fond of saying Vasudev Kutumbakam, the world is a family. That sentiment, I feel, is a perfect example of a distinctly Indian notion that both transcends and unites cultures and civilizations. The trouble is that while Huntington was mostly wrong, he was also somewhat right. There remain exceptions around the margins, threatening ourselves of a global interconnected and a set of interconnected and cooperative cultures. We see this with Boko Haram, or Al-Qaeda, or Lashkar-e-Taiba. ISIS, I think we can all agree, is beyond the pale, a threat to all civilizations, indiscriminately targeting innocent people regardless of faith or nationality. The clash of civilizations, though, is also playing out in a slightly milder form in another place, and that's with respect to China. By and large, China has integrated itself into the global community, but Beijing has also propagated a view of itself as a civilization state, and not just any civilization state, but the Middle Kingdom. The notion of Sinic civilizational superiority translates into, for example, into interpretations of maritime jurisdiction that in turn threaten to undermine freedom of navigation, as in the South China Sea. I often find there's a tendency to be cynical about international politics, that the world is a giant chessboard and that we're all playing some sort of great game. But we're not. International politics is really a matter of life and death. And beyond mere survival, what is it that we are fighting for, if not our culture? I may not have suggested any revolutionary ideas, but they are, I think, essential to begin any conversation about cultures in conflict. Culture has mattered historically, and it continues to matter today. But it is not and never has been unchanging. It can be shaped, it can evolve, for better and for worse. Second, a clash of cultures has fortunately not come about. Civilizations are by and large competitors in peace, but our civilizations collectively are being challenged around the margins by the forces of nihilism and civilizational superiority that undermines global consent. We cannot live in denial of these facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruv. That was the way, as I said, cultures do matter. They may not collide, and they also keep changing. And I think the Chinese example is the perfect case of literally the Hegelian idea shaping the world. Dr. Walter Anderson, over for your 9 minutes of clash.
Well, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me, and particularly the chair of this particular conference, who I've known for a very long time and have interacted with in many different contexts. And I thank him for chairing this session for us and for you. And in part because I think this is a very interesting discussion of clash of civilizations and what it means. There's no doubt that civilization, as all the previous speakers have noted, have an impact on human behavior. But my argument, and I think that Dhruv and I have a similar view on this, believe that civilization is not a major source of public, of war, or even to a large extent, public tensions in the world, and I'll go into that in a few minutes why I think so. The concept of civilization as an agent in public and world politics took on significance with Samuel Huntington's thesis in the early 1990s, asserting that the prevalent form of global conflict will occur along the fault lines of major civilizations. And he even spelled out what he considered were the major civilizations. And they are Western, which usually means, for him in any case, populations that either adhere to Roman Catholicism or various forms of Protestantism. And I should say at this point, he and others have often defined civilization, and to a certain extent culture, in religious terms, rather than in any of the other possible variables you should use. So, when I mention the various civilizations he's defined, I'll include with it the religion that he identified with it. So first is Western. Second is Confucian, which he defines as a combination of Confucian ethics and Buddhism. Then Japanese, somewhat similarly. Islamic, Hindu, which he's actually quite vague about in determining what is Hindu civilization. Then you have Slavic Orthodox Christian, Latin American, which is largely Roman Catholic, and more vaguely African civilization. He also argues that modernization and economic development are separating people from their local identities, which in turn is weakening the nation state as a source of identity among people, and driving them, and this is one of his central theses, driving them toward a larger civilizational identity. Now, his thesis has been widely attacked by many scholars, some who have tested this proposition empirically, and they claim that the results show that most conflicts in the past century have been between countries of similar civilizational background and not different backgrounds. World War I is a classic example of that, and more recently, the Iran-Iraq War. And one might even say the various fights of the Islamic State also tend to undermine his thesis. Most of the fighting of the Islamic State has been in the Middle East against other Muslims. Most of the people it has killed are Muslims. And even in the case of the attack in Paris, this was not justified by them as an attack on Christians and Jews. It was justified because they said that France was participating in a bombing campaign in the Middle East against them, and therefore this was kind of payback action on their part. The nation, in my view, still remains the largest group identity to which most people belong. And nationalism, by extension, is a far more important factor and potent factor in world politics than is civilization. The reason for this is that civilizations are more or less intellectual rather than political agents of change. Civilizations are devoid of decision-making power or control over political or economic resources. Nations, and to a certain extent international organizations like the UN or WTO, are the agents of action. This does not mean that civilizations are not important. They are one of several factors in shaping international politics. And the other factors, of course, are political, military, economic, demographic, and ideological. I'll give you one example of the historical significance of a civilizational factor in the conduct of international relations on the part of many Indians as they looked at developing a relationship with countries of East Asia. An important strain of Indian nationalism, as many of you know, dating back to at least the late 19th century, has looked at East Asia as culturally similar and as such playing an important role in ridding Asia of European colonialism in ways that would help India's own struggle for independence. The country that was at the core of these views was Japan, and I think here of Subhas Chandra Bose. India's current Act East policy has elements of both economics and culture informing it, though probably more of the former than the latter in terms of action. Huntington also argued, and here I agree with him, that modernization does not eliminate traditional cultural elements, but rather they adapt to a continuing impact on the culture of a country or the civilization of a country. The European Enlightenment and its disciples, perhaps best represented by Karl Marx, variant of it, denigrates the past, traditional cultural values, as is inconsistent with modernity and the requirements of the modern age, and predicts the ultimate demise of tradition. Inherited hierarchy as a source of status and power, for example, they argue, will inevitably be replaced by merit. If tradition persists, they argue, the developing world will miss the benefits of modernity. At this point, I'd like to very briefly mention the argument of two scholars who were my own advisors at the University of Chicago, Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph, who disagree strongly with this thesis, that tradition and modernity are radically different. Arguing this conclusion is a misdiagnosis of tradition as well as misunderstanding of what constitutes modernity, and they draw most of their examples from South Asia. This simplistic view, they argue, misses the complexity of tradition in all civilizations on the one hand, as well as the persistence of traditional values, even in the most industrialized society. One example they analyze is the roots of entrepreneurship in traditional Indian society. Many Western social scientists have identified entrepreneurship as a key driver of modernization. And they have often associated that with the rise of Protestantism and liberalism in a specifically West European concept. Yet recent historical research indicates that the ethics of the traditional merchant classes of South Asia could be channeled into behavior appropriate to modern entrepreneurial exercises and enterprises. I think here of the Marwari merchant families who emerged out of the villages of Rajasthan in the 19th century, spread all over Asia and the world with a work ethic and a management style that would be the envy of Protestant merchants in the Netherlands and England in the 17th century. They applied the most modern management techniques to establish a range of modern businesses in a variety of areas, and yet they retained a large part of their traditional culture, and in fact, that traditional culture probably was a major asset in developing the businesses that they were engaged in. So what does this all tell us about the clash of civilizations? I think Huntington is right that there are persistent cultural values that both create zones of common cultural influence, Indic, Cynic, to name two that he refers to, and also shape how people's respond to the forces of modernization. These unique cultural influences guarantee that the world will not become a variant of the US, which many development social scientists once argued and some still do. But cultural civilizational values also do not propel countries to fight each other along the frontiers of cultural zones, as Huntington predicts. Conflicts are carried out by states and not civilizations. And the motives usually do not involve civilization or cultural differences, but are rather contests over territory, markets, and resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I think you're absolutely right that cultures in that sense, the Marwadi culture you talked about, but it can change rapidly. The Tamil Brahmin community is an example, deprived of first government jobs and their admission to professional colleges because of restrictions on numbers of general candidates, in one generation have become international and entrepreneurial. In one generation. So I think the fact that, yes, civilizations obviously don't fight each other. Countries do, absolutely. We'll now open up the floor to questions. We'll take 4 or 5 at one time. Please, as the morning chairman said, making a question, 1-2 sentences. If you're making a presentation, we'll request the organizers to slot you next year for the next year's conclave. But let's be get the best out of our great 4 panelists who have been very disciplined. We'll take 4 or 5 at a time and then go back to you. So do I see any hands? I see one hand right in front. So we'll start with the lady in front. I've got 3 ladies lined up. 1, 2, 3.
I'm Saroj Pala, Director of Institute of Scientific Research on Vedas. My question is that when we are talking about the topic of resolving conflicts, cultural conflicts or conflicts in cultures, I think, is there not a major need to scientifically trace the history of cultures to find the common, to generate the shared memories, as in the words of APJ Abdul Kalam, that for 10,000 years cultures have been evolving, developing, and there are so many common links. Probably we have focused at very short tenure of 100 years, 200 years. If we trace them back and find common links, probably there can be better integration.
Thank you.
My question.
Yeah, Ambassador Sikri.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists for the intervention. I basically have 2 points to make. The first is that religion, culture, and tradition must be seen as an integrated whole. The problem is when you try and separate religion from the other aspects of culture and tradition. Religion is one part of your identity, not the entire or maybe not even the most important part. And in India, you can see in Goa and Kerala where people who from different religions value their cultural and traditional similarities much more than the religion. Second point I'd like to make is that neither religion nor culture nor tradition should be allowed to become an excuse for violence. And I think that is the most important takeaway. Whatever we may say, one of the panelists said that there's a certain excuse being given for the violence in Paris. There can be no excuse for violence. I think that should be the most important learning from civilizations that this group should come away with. Otherwise, there is no use for anything. Whatever difference you have, solve it without violence. That's all.
2 rows behind her, please. That lady's hand. No, not you. The lady over there was up from, hand was up. I don't see anybody from this side.
Mr. Peterle, hi. I'm Nupur Sharma. I'm an advocate in Delhi. Do you not, okay, I'm going to sound politically incorrect, but do you not think that when we say that terrorism has nothing to do with religion, this thought needs to be re-looked into? Take the case of France. Take the case of Paris attacks.
I think you made your point.
Why?
You made a very good
Allow
point.
me to ask the question, please. Why did the terrorists take the name of God and then open fire?
Absolutely.
If it had nothing to do with religion. Secondly, while internationally we speak, we cannot blame one religion. In India, we are quick to say Hindu Taliban, Bhagwa Atangwad. So this is my question. If we are doing it, let's do it in toto. Otherwise, let's not deny the problem at hand, perhaps aggravating it.
Dr. Ganguly, Dr. Anirban Ganguly.
Namaskar. As long as there are religions which say that they and they alone are true and that its God has said that the rest of the humanity should be converted to that religion, there will be conflicts. Now, should not there be any reformation in those religions which say we alone are correct? My God told me that you should change everybody else to my religion.
Dr. Gandhi, you gave up your chance, right? You don't raise your hand.
But since if you are insisting,
No, I won't insist. I thought it was your hand. My mistake. The lights are too strong.
But
There's a lady here who wanted to ask also.
My question is to the parliamentarian from Europe. Do you think the trend of Western jihadi fighters fighting in Syria will lead to counter-radicalization of European societies?
Okay. I think we've taken a good round and, okay, last question of this round, Dr. Vijay. How can I ignore a parliamentarian?
No, my question is addressed to the parliamentarian from Europe and Mr. Walter Anderson, that how he looks at the attack on Paris in view of the culture, to look at it from a cultural clash viewpoint, and what kind of a culture you think will be emerging after this, in view of what you said, that it's not civilization but state that is at clash. So what kind of a state is at clash in Paris? So is it not true that those who say that they're the religion of peace also have been creating the largest number of clashes in the world today, and how Europe and America are looking at that?
Going to handle it. So now let's start answering. The basic question was what's happening in Europe, the Paris attack. Basically, how is Europe and America going to interact, how to react to this? People saying their religion of peace, and yet carrying out massive killings. That was Tarun Vijay's point, I think. Let's start from one end. Why don't you start? When the light is off, the mic is on. Thank you.
Mic is on? Okay. On the last question that was asked by my friend Tarun Vijay, who I knew would ask a tough question on Paris, my argument is that the issue in Paris was, in my view, not a civilizational issue. And you had also asked, in relation to that question, is ISIS a state or is it something else? In fact, ISIS is a state. It's the Islamic State. It controls an area. In some ways, it's at war with both the current states of Syria and Iraq, as well as others. And the justification for what it did in Paris was not a religious justification. It was a justification of a state, that France has been involved in bombing. And this is payback for that particular type of bombing. And look at who have been the victims of ISIS. The overwhelming majority of victims have been other Muslims. This is not saying that they're tolerant. They are not. They are extremely intolerant. As you know, in the recent town that was captured from them, they found the bodies of thousands of Yazidis, a particular sect in the Middle East that was considered unorthodox and therefore not worthy to survive. So yes, there is a great deal of intolerance in their own activities. And if I have time, I could just spread to one other question that was asked about religion. As I understand, is that person was asking about religion in the context of violence as well. And here again, just to repeat the point I made to Taran, yes, religions can be intolerant, but often for the most obvious of non-religious reasons, they are intolerant for one reason or the other. Let me give you a historical example or examples of how religion was used to spread colonialism. In the name of God, many of the European powers seized territory for gold, tea, opium eventually, and other things. One of my academic hats is in China. Chinese will talk about the opium wars and the efforts to colonize parts of China for economic reasons. Though some people often gave it a religious connotation, and that was often done by some European powers. We're spreading the word of God. Well, in fact, they were spreading the word of their own country for very material terms and for a geostrategic advantage. So I think, in fact, in my mind, is that I look at what they did, I think that was a far more important motive than was the effort to either convert or to change the faith of people, which they did go about, but that wasn't the real motive that drove them.
Since the questions were all general, not addressed to anybody specific, other than a couple of questions to you, and all our panelists should be able to react. But Walter, just before Mr. Pitler, you start, when the Portuguese and the Spanish were competing for territories, the Pope drew a line in the Atlantic Ocean, east and west. In the name of Christ, so Goa was conquered by Alfonso de Albuquerque in the name of Christ. So in that sense, at that moment of time, obviously they were equally driven by. Yes.
Thank you. Many things were done in the name of God by different religions, and I would wish, as a believer, that no religion is misused against humanity or against dignity of one man or one nation. And I'm pleased what was said by Mr. Anderson with regard to Paris. I didn't intend to say that there was no relation at all to the religion, but it is obvious that we cannot blame one religion for what happened there. And there was a well-organized attempt of the Islamic State, which also took responsibility for that. I would say only that religious card was played in order to attract attention, let's say so, or support for what they did or what they also still intend to do. And the history, I would say, is quite full of such misuses. And I would like to tell you that a few days ago, before I left for India, in the European Parliament we had a very, very interesting meeting with representatives of a new established organization of Islamic experts from the world who decided to deal with the heritage of Islam as far as violence is concerned. They said that they don't see any reason in the main messages of Islam for violence, but of course nobody can control those who use such messages to reach their different interests. And those experts also said that jihad at the beginning was, I would say, personal war to deal with personal weaknesses. It was war to improve yourself, not to improve somebody else. This, they said, was the initial concept of jihad, which later was interpreted also interpret the rule in different way. So what Europe and the United States will do, I would say in general terms that I think is not that important what is Western, what is Eastern, but what is sustainable, what we can and should do together. And I think that with the growing attention to sustainability, I think we know more and more what is sustainable and what is not. I don't enjoy, as a politician and also not as a believer, these division lines we are used to speak about, or west, east, or north and south, and so on. I think that in this globalized world where we are all interconnected, each of us can undertake initiative in whatever second and can reach whomever in this world, which is definitely a new situation, and I think that we should speak more about citizens, about persons which are involved. So I think that we should be attentive to those elements in our cultures which allow us or which inspire us to agree on common denominators. I think diversity will be always fact. We have the slogan European Union, unity in diversity, but I think that we will never have such an ideal situation that some people wouldn't use even the best, I would say, what we dispose to reach the goals which are not in line with humanitarian, with human values. So I could speak also as a politician that we need more unity in European Union as far as foreign and security policy is concerned. You see that we are not always united. We don't have yet very strong common and foreign security policy. There are different interests of 28 member states, and part of the situation we are facing is also a consequence of that lack of unity. And we are facing at the same time now refugees problems and so on. So I think that the European Union has to reconsider some, I would say, basic ideas which allowed development of the European Union. I think we have to reconsider what does it mean to respect human dignity and what does this mean do things together, the so-called communitarian method. And I would wish that the European Union was able to find its new spirit and new common denominators, because the challenges we are facing, none of them, let's speak about climate change or terrorism or refugees or extremism and so on, no country is able to overcome on its own. Even Germany is a minority within the European Union. They are only 80 million of 500 million. So I do hope we will be mature enough to see that we have to do something else than what we were able to show so far.
Thank you very much. I'm reminded, this discussion reminds me of a comment I made some time ago. I said that the palm, I pointed out, was the creator, and the fingers attached to the palm were his creation. Now the different fingers might look different. Some are small, some are longer, some are slightly wider, some are thinner, but it doesn't matter because they're all conjoined to the palm. And the palm doesn't function better without the fingers. And the fingers, if they're not joined to the palm, they are not part of the process of doing anything. So culture is similarly something where there's diversity, but there has to be inclusiveness. And that is something which is most important for us to remember. Because if we forget that what is being together, then we are taking the first step of moving away from each other, and that does not help in any way. I would like to just point out one small thing, which is that within each society, as we move on, especially in this era of digitalization and social media, we have to remember there has to be responsible use of freedom of expression. Because I was involved with right to information for a very long time. I was Chief Information Commissioner in my country. And I remember addressing a meeting of the World Bank and telling them that if you want a degree of peaceful coexistence in South Asia, because we are 1/5 of the population of the world, we have to remember that there is diversity. At the same time, it's like when you see a rainbow, there are 7 different colors. It only adds to the beauty of being there together. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to make just 2 points to address the first 2 questions that were asked. On the first question about finding common origins or commonalities in traditions, Sigmund Freud coined a phrase, the narcissism of small differences. And I think it applies in this context. Some of the most savage wars in history have been fought over the small differences. Consider 200 years of religious war between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, or the more recent violence between Sunnis and Shias. For these reasons, finding commonalities, as President Kalam suggested, may be a noble enterprise, but it's unlikely to change attitudes. In fact, there's a danger that people will, in fact, seize upon the differences. On the second question about violence, when I was talking about civilizational consent, I think what was implicit in that was no violence. And I think this is widely understood. It's enshrined in international law, in any number of international resolutions and understandings. But beyond condemning violence, and it's easy to condemn violence, what is it that we're willing to do? We read, for example, about people from around the world volunteering to join and fight for ISIS. How many people are willing to volunteer and fight against ISIS? So I think it's something to think about. Thank you.
We'll take another round of questions. The gentleman here, a lady there, and then you. The gentleman here in the coat.
What exactly is the role that we ascribe to the political establishments,
Right.
political parties, which takes care of, which are expected to take care of the flow of culture from the civilization? And if a culture suggests that there must be a recognition for good work and at the same time a punishment for bad work, and if that is the commonality of the cultures, which the first questioner suggests, which he's tried to answer, why not the same be popularized?
There was a hand at the back. Yeah. Just behind. Wow. Yeah, there.
I'm Anumeha Mishra.
Then to Tariq Fateh, and then to the gentleman here, and then here. So I've got 5 questions lined up, and that's it. Yes.
I'm
please.
Anumeha Mishra. I'm a student in law. My question is that one of the important criticisms of globalization is that it fails to take into account plural values. And what I feel is maybe this is the important flaw while there are so many clashes in civilization. So my question is, can globalization and pluralism go hand in hand?
Thank you. Very good point. Yes.
My question is to the European delegate there. I mean, you are from Slovenia, former Yugoslavia. You cut up your own country into 50 different parts and had an entire war in the heart of, and you're suggesting that we all come around. And you should know more than anyone else what is the role of Islam in that Yugoslavian civil war. The entire Bosnian culture became a prisoner of Saudi Arabia. And yet, I mean, if there was a place I could jump in a well, I would have done that, to suggest that there was no religion involvement in the Paris attacks. As a Muslim, I'm offended at the patronizing attitude of so many Western liberals who suggest that can't we all get along? And why are you meeting with the imams to tell you what the future of Islam is? The very people who put us in this madness of 1 million people dead find an audience with you?
There was a gentleman here you wanted to ask, right? Yes, the mic is next to you. And uske baad yahan samne.
My name is Sridhar Damle from Chicago. My question is, culture is a combination of good and bad tradition. But theology and foreign policy of different country using these as a tool to divide society. So why can't we have clear thought about this?
Thank you. Right in front.
Many ideas in India emerge from its spiritual roots. Last year we saw yoga and meditation cutting across borders and being accepted by so many countries, maybe exception like Pakistan. And this year we see that more than 50 countries are now beginning to accept Meatless Monday. Maybe a few more packages in Indian spiritual values for the practical use may make a better world in the future.
Thank you. Very short questions. Very, very short. Okay. Come in, the lady there. Very quick. One sentence each, we're running out of time now.
Yes, the question is addressed to Professor Anderson primarily. You said Marxism was trying to uniformize human beings around a new set of values. Yet, we see that there was a lot of protection and preservation of traditional cultures in the Soviet Union, whereas modern so-called universal values are in fact trying to uniformize societies around a common set of rules that may or may not be universal at all. How do you explain the divergence between so-called liberal capitalism and Marxism? Thank you.
The lady here in the sari.
My question is very different here. Nobody talked about culture and the politics and the mix of it. And I'm just very, reminded of recent Bihar election where everything was mixed together. Where are we taking and what role does culture play in politics and how? And I think most of the questions have been asked related to international, but I think we need to work closer home and see how that impacts.
Basically, of course, since we're discussing cultures in conflict, I guess that's where domestic politics was left out. But let's start the quick responses, and then I'll say, Walter, would you once again start?
Let me take two, and then I'll get to the third, which was addressed specifically to me for an answer on Marxism. The two I'm interested in is the issue of yoga spreading from India all over the world. And if you live in the United States, yoga has become extremely popular. It's getting into schools and high schools, and along with an element of other cultural issues and aspects of India have gone along with that. And when you combine that with the question of globalization and pluralism and the relationship, which is one of the questions as to what was the relationship of globalism and pluralism. Well, this is a perfect example of a globalization of a part of Indian culture that has led to a more plural situation in the United States. And I think you could duplicate this many times as you think about this issue. I think that there is a direct relationship of globalization and pluralism, and in my view, it's a good thing.
I've just been told that
we're out of time
already.
Okay.
Let's do one sentences.
Okay, so then I'll have one sentence on the other, and it was on Marxism and the existence of liberalism. Yes, there was a certain amount of that. But I don't think there's any doubt that the Marxist critique was one that was very much against preserving of tradition. Let me use one small example from the Soviet Union. Lenin in the 1920s did his best to destroy Christianity, often using the notion that it was the opiate of the people, and kill priests, nuns, monks, and monasteries, and close monasteries. During the Second World War, Stalin, to generate enthusiasm for the war, began to reopen the churches again. It lasted only a while until that specific use declined. Often the pluralism had a political context to it. And I think you have to often keep that in mind. But there were certain elements of the tradition that existed. And if that were not the case, you could not have had what I think was kind of the remarkable revival of Russian Orthodoxy in what had been the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet government.
Thank you. How much time we still have in order to clarify?
We are -2 at this moment of time.
But first, we celebrated Yoga Day in the European Parliament with Sri Ravi Shankar. It was wonderful. Then, less wonderful thing, I thank you for the question on Balkans. You know, former Yugoslavia did not disappear because of Islam or because of democratic forces. It was finished because the Yugoslav communists were not able to agree how to continue with Yugoslavia. As I said before, it lost its soul. There was no more spirit. And nations, there were 6 republics, we call them nations, peoples, they wished to live in freedom and democracy, not in the dictatorship, what was a communist Yugoslavia. We had very mild Islam in Bosnia and Herzegovina, very mild Islam, and Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina were respected very much, I would say. But the Muslims got radicalized in Bosnia after the civil war, where 3 different elements were fighting against each other. So Islam was not a problem at that time. And now, in the space of former Yugoslavia, relations are much more normal as they were before, but there are still sources of possible conflict development. My second point, you mentioned those experts we met in Brussels. I'm pleased that they came, because they fight against interpretations of Islam which may lead to violence and extremism. And they have their own website also, ISIS under the microscope, and you can see how they fight against theses that they spread around in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll have just 2 points. As the former ambassador to Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's my pleasure to note that things have improved in Bosnia now over the last 12 years. And that is a very good point, positive point, that culture is the least common denominator which is being used to mix with Croatia, Slovenia, and with other countries. The second point is we must remember we have a classical example in our part of the world, in South Asia. We had in 1947 the emergence of Pakistan based on religious determination. But it was used by people in what was then West Pakistan to carry out economic discrimination against the people of East Pakistan. And later on they tried to fuel the war in 1971 based on cultural differences by using religious connotations. So we have to look beyond and inside everything to find the real cause, and then look at it and, like a doctor, prescribe the right antibiotic. Thank you.
Just one point from me. I must say I was a little bit surprised by the first question that was asked, and I think I'd like to be clear. Globalization is not monolithic. The idea that globalization somehow goes against pluralism was sort of fashionable in the 1990s, but has since largely been marginalized. China and India are not turning into variations of America because of globalization. They're turning into variations of China and India. Globalization is in fact the acceleration of modernism. And unless you think that you can't be Indian and modern at the same time, I don't see an integral conflict in between globalization and pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you, though. I think we've had an excellent 1 hour of discussions, very good questions. I'll just close by saying a couple of lines only, not more than that, is that yes, there are a lot of commonalities which have to be stressed, but where there are conflicts, they have to be faced head on and not with our heads in the sand. unfortunately, as Sultan Shaheen rightly says, we look for the ulema with the long white beard, not for the ulema who says that India is neither Darul Islam nor Darul Harb, but Darul Sulah, where the Muslims and the others have equal right to elect and reject governments. But that ulema gets no publicity. It's the Owaisis and the Bukharis and the others who get all the publicity. So I think we need not be compromising, but we need not be intolerant. The two are not in contradiction. So thank you very much, all our four panelists. It's been a great afternoon.